We begin with breaking news. Former Mayor Catherine Pugh has been indicted. She's facing federal charges from conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tax evasion, all coming from her sales of her children's book, Healthy Holly. She resigned from office after the scandal back in May.
We all know this indictment comes 7 months after the FBI raided her home, offices, and other locations, all linked to their investigation into her business dealings. WJZ has team coverage of these new developments.
And we'll begin with WJZ investigator Mike Helgren live at the federal courthouse, where Pugh will make her first court appearance less than 24 hours from now. Mike.
Rick and Nicole, some of these children's books had so many grammatical and spelling errors they couldn't even use them in city classrooms. The former mayor faces 175 years in federal prison. She's not likely to serve that much time. She is expected to turn herself in to U.S. Marshals, and no comment on any possible plea deal from the U.S. attorney tonight. Federal authorities laid out an 11-count indictment against former Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh, unsealed this morning, that could land her in prison for decades.
There are many victims in this case. The victims are all of us, the taxpayers and the people of Baltimore, who expect and deserve integrity from their public officials.
Pugh is accused of selling hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of her Healthy Holly children's books to enrich her political campaign and herself. According to the indictment, she lied on her tax returns in 2016, reporting $31,000 in income when she really made more than $320,000.
Mr. Herr, can you talk about the work that went into piecing all this together, because this took years?
They do take time because there are a lot of different puzzle pieces, a lot of different payments, and a lot of different people in order to interview, in order to try to fit all the puzzle pieces together.
Former Pugh aide Gary Brown Jr. is one of 2 of the former mayor's associates to enter guilty pleas. Federal authorities allege Brown helped the former mayor funnel Healthy Holly proceeds to her political campaign, disguising where the cash came from.
Is there more to come in this?
I'm not at liberty to comment at this point.
The indictment caps years of investigative work, including federal raids on City Hall and Pugh's home, which she may have to forfeit.
Ms. Pugh violated that trust and abused her position. The interests she prioritized were her own.
This is a tragedy, and the last thing that our city needs.
And Pugh's attorney Steve Silverman declined to comment today. He says he'll do his talking in the courtroom. Pugh faces a judge here at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Reporting live at 7 at the federal courthouse, Mike Helgren, WJZ.
WJZ investigator Mike Helgren joins us on the phone with more on the indictment. Mike, what more can you tell us?
Max, a detailed indictment that covers years of fraud, 11 counts. Former Mayor Pugh faces more than 100 years in federal prison. In 1 year, in 2016, she said that she only made $31,000. She'd actually made more than $322,000. That's what the government alleges. They also say that she was funneling money from Healthy Holly into her campaign, and she was using untraceable names, straw donations, so that no one would know. Some of these donors to Healthy Holly never got the books, that this was all a scheme to further her political career. We have not yet heard from Mayor Pugh's legal team. She's expected to turn herself in, and she has a court appearance tomorrow at 1 o'clock. But as you said, the U.S. attorney is going to detail more of this at 10 this morning. And there was also a guilty plea from 2 of her associates, including Gary Brown Jr., who worked with her campaign. That's the latest, Max.
We begin with breaking news. Former Mayor Catherine Pugh has been indicted. She's facing federal charges from conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tax evasion, all coming from her sales of her children's book, Healthy Holly. She resigned from office after the scandal back in May. Now, a press conference will be held at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore at 10 o'clock this morning. WJZ investigator Mike Helgren joins us on the phone with more on the indictment. Mike, what more can you tell us?
Oh, Max, we know they've been working on this for some time. There are 11 counts here, and the mayor faces more than 100 years in prison if she is convicted. We have yet to hear from her attorney. Speaking of that tax fraud, back in 2016, she said she only made a little more than $30,000. She actually made more than $300,000, the government alleges. They also allege that she was secretly funneling the proceeds from that Healthy Holly children's book into her campaign fund and trying to disguise that, and that's one of those violations. They also indicted several of her associates, one of them, Gary Brown Jr., who helped handle her nonprofit and handled some tax returns. He has already pleaded guilty in this case. This indictment actually was handed down on November 14th. It was unsealed today. The mayor has an upcoming court appearance. She is expected to self-surrender to the U.S. Marshals. But this all came to light, actually, back in March when we learned about some $800,000 in proceeds that the mayor had gotten for her Healthy Holly book. And she ended up resigning in May, saying she was sorry for the harm that she had caused. But we haven't really heard from her since even before that, when she had that bizarre press conference when she was touting her line of children's clothing. And she initially said that these charges were a witch hunt against her. This has brought a number of reforms to organizations like UMMS, the large medical center. She was on the board, and they reformed how that board was handled, that there would be no more stealth dealing on that board, people who were on the board getting money for doing services like the Healthy Holly children's books, and some of those books were never even delivered. Again, the mayor has been indicted on 11 different counts, faces lengthy federal prison sentences. We're expected to hear from the U.S. attorney coming up at 10 o'clock, but he did put a statement out saying our elected officials must place the interests of the citizens above their own. Corrupt public employees rip off the taxpayers and undermine everyone's faith in government. The U.S. Attorney's Office and our law enforcement partners will zealously pursue those who abuse the taxpayers' trust and bring them to justice. Max?
So the troubles surrounding Pugh have been well documented. So you spent a lot of time with Catherine Pugh as well as her supporters in Baltimore. What do you think their reaction to this news will be, Mike?
Well, I remember being outside her house when all this was really at its peak, just before she resigned, and they held a prayer circle for her. She had people who were coming to her home and staying with her. Remember, she said she had pneumonia. She was very ill. She never personally made an appearance when she resigned. She let her lawyer do the talking, that very, very brief press conference. But I know she has a number of close friends and supporters, and I'm sure she has people who are going to be trying to provide her some sort of support. Again, we haven't heard from her attorney in this, but once you're federally charged, I mean, these are going to be very tough charges to fight. And remember, they collected a lot of evidence, including those raids at City Hall and both of the mayor's homes.
Okay, if you're just joining us, former Mayor Catherine Pugh has been indicted. She's facing federal charges from conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tax evasion coming from her sales of her children's book, Healthy Holly. The press conference at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore at 10 a.m. That was WJZ investigator Mike Helgren reporting live on the phone. Mike, thank you very much for your time.
We're following some developments out of Baltimore tonight where former Mayor Catherine Pugh has been hit with wire and tax fraud charges. Pugh resigned in May. She left office following revelations that the hospital board she sat on bought large quantities of her children's book called Healthy Holly. Now, we've learned that other board members also had questionable deals with the University of Maryland medical system. Agents with the FBI and the IRS raided her home, and this is what lawyers with the Justice Department had to say.
There are many victims in this case. The victims are all of us, the taxpayers and the people of Baltimore who expect and deserve integrity from their public officials. The people of Baltimore expect, and they should expect, that elected officials place the interests of their citizens above their own.
Court documents say Pugh accepted payments for books that she never intended to deliver. She is due to appear in court tomorrow.
11 counts, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and wire fraud. 2 of her former aides plead guilty. The former mayor will be in federal court tomorrow to answer the charges. C4, we expected this.
We did. It is still, though, a very historic day in Baltimore where we have a mayor who at one point came into office in 2016, December 2016, on an ethics transparency agenda.
Absolutely.
Now we see her being part of a decade. Let me go back to 2010 is where the indictment begins, Robert, with a basically a you know, if you want to call it a laundering effort.
Various things, money laundering, double purchases of books,
amazing.
Books that were never delivered. There were 4 Healthy Holly books. Underreporting her in the tax evasion part, underreporting her income 10 to 20 times.
Creating, as part of this scheme, creating 1099 forms that were for non-existent purposes, paying this one employee under the table because they didn't want this employee to have tax obligations by giving him a chest. I mean, like Robert Hur said, U.S. Attorney Hur said, this was a truly well thought out, structured type of criminal situation going on.
If she is convicted of all of the charges and sentenced consecutively, this is
175 years.
But 175 years. Catherine Pugh is 69 years old, and the question came up of a possible plea deal.
Exactly.
The U.S. Attorney said he wouldn't comment on that. That is fairly typical, but there is the possibility she might name names.
Well, there's a lot of big questions in this, but who are the purchasers A through G?
Right.
Because
7 different purchasers.
One of the things that's important to understand is there were people who bought these Healthy Holly books who knew they weren't getting books.
Right.
I mean, and that's the issue that U.S. Attorney Hur said is, you know, you really look at the double sale, for instance. If I'm buying $100,000 worth of books, I never get a book. What was I buying, Robert? What actually was I getting for that money?
It is still an open case, according to the U.S. Attorney, and the U.S. Attorney got involved and the FBI got involved back in March.
3 years ago.
3 years ago, but back in March, we started learning about this.
Right.
From state senator, now congressional candidate Jill Carter.
That's correct.
Kicked off Luke Broadwater, the Baltimore Sun, others about self-dealings by the University of Maryland Medical System Board, where Catherine Pugh was a member.
Correct.
For years.
And that opened the door.
The complete board was overhauled. Senator Carter told me today, no, this is not vindication for her, but it's a very sad day for Baltimore, and it shows a lot of things. The fact that Catherine Pugh felt she needed to make this money to run for mayor. It says something about
look at the whole board. The whole board got overturned.
It says something. The whole board got overturned. It says something about that. It says something about the influence of money in politics.
But also, Robert, the fact that the FBI, can't remember her name, the FBI lead agent, she said this investigation has been going at least since January of 2017. So the question you have to ask is, how many other people might be ensnared in this public corruption case?
You can read the indictment for yourself, and more details, more reaction to this historic day in Baltimore on WBAL.com and the WBAL app. You can also listen to continuing coverage of the impeachment hearings. They will continue tomorrow, but the C4 show will return
Robert.
9 to 1 on WBAL, News Radio 1090 and FM 101.5.
Good morning. I am Robert Hur, United States Attorney for the District of Maryland. We're here today to announce the federal indictment of former Baltimore City Mayor Catherine Pugh on federal tax and wire fraud charges, as well as the guilty pleas of Gary Brown Jr. and Rosalind Weddington. A federal indictment has been unsealed, charging Catherine Pugh with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 7 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and 2 counts of tax evasion. There are many victims in this case. The victims are all of us, the taxpayers and the people of Baltimore who expect and deserve integrity from their public officials. The people of Baltimore expect, and they should expect, that elected officials place the interests of their citizens above their own. Unfortunately, the allegations in Ms. Pugh's indictment and the facts as laid out in Mr. Brown's and Ms. Weddington's plea agreements indicate a betrayal of the public trust. Ms. Pugh took office as mayor of the city of Baltimore on December 6, 2016. According to the indictment, she owned Healthy Holly LLC, a company that she used to publish and sell children's books that she had authored. Between June 2011 and August 2017, 4 Healthy Holly books were published, with each book listing Ms. Pugh as the author. The vast majority of books published by Healthy Holly were marketed and sold directly to nonprofit organizations and foundations, many of whom did business or attempted to do business with the Maryland and Baltimore City governments. The allegations in the indictment fall into two categories, those relating to wire fraud and those relating to tax-related charges. In the first category, the indictment alleges that from November 2011 until March 2019, Ms. Pugh conspired with Gary Brown to defraud purchasers of Healthy Holly books in order to enrich themselves, promote Ms. Pugh's political career, and fund her campaign for mayor. Mr. Brown helped Ms. Pugh solicit nonprofit organizations and foundations to buy the Healthy Holly books. The indictment alleges that Ms. Pugh and Mr. Brown employed several methods. First, by accepting payment for the books, but then not delivering them. Second, accepting payments for books and having them delivered, but then converting those books to their own use without the buyer's knowledge. And finally, by double selling books without either buyer's knowledge or consent. In other words, selling copies of a book to one buyer and then selling the same copies of the book to a different buyer. Ms. Pugh allegedly stored quantities of fraudulently obtained Healthy Holly books at various locations, including her residence, her state legislative offices in Annapolis and Baltimore City, her mayoral office at City Hall here in Baltimore, the War Memorial Building in Baltimore, and a public storage locker used by her mayoral campaign. For example, according to the indictment, thousands of books that one particular buyer had bought and donated to the Baltimore City public schools were delivered to and stored in a warehouse used by the school system. Ms. Pugh and Mr. Brown allegedly arranged for thousands of these books to be removed from that warehouse for her own personal use. Ms. Pugh also allegedly arranged for some books bought as donations to the Baltimore City Public Schools to be delivered directly from the printer to her own office in Baltimore. This was another way in which Ms. Pugh and Mr. Brown secured a free inventory of books for her own personal use. Ms. Pugh allegedly used the proceeds of the sale of fraudulently obtained Healthy Holly books for her own purposes, including to fund straw donations to her mayoral election campaign, and also to fund the purchase and renovation of a home in Baltimore City. In the second category of charges that relate to tax violations, the indictment alleges that Ms. Pugh sought to evade the assessment of taxes for income generated from the sale of Healthy Holly books. According to the indictment, Ms. Pugh and Mr. Brown created the pretense of an ongoing business relationship between Healthy Holly and Mr. Brown's business. Ms. Pugh wrote checks to Mr. Brown for tens of thousands of dollars from Healthy Holly's bank account. Ms. Pugh allegedly told her tax preparer that the payments to Mr. Brown's business were for business services that he provided, and she then instructed the tax preparer to deduct those payments as business expenses in order to lower her tax liability. However, these payments from Healthy Holly LLC to Mr. Brown's business were not for business services. In reality, Mr. Brown's business provided no services or products at all to Healthy Holly LLC. This was a ruse, according to the indictment. Ms. Pugh and Mr. Brown created false documents to make this ruse stronger. Ms. Pugh allegedly caused a false Form 1099 to be issued to the IRS, reporting the payments to Mr. Brown as business expenses. Mr. Brown, for his part, created fake invoices to correspond to the payments that he received from the Healthy Holly bank account. What was really going on, according to the indictment, Mr. Brown cashed out over $62,000 of these checks, all of which went to Ms. Pugh or to fund straw donations to her campaign committee. Through the sham alleged in the indictment, Ms. Pugh did two things. One, she lied to the IRS in order to pay less in taxes. Two, she violated Maryland state election law, which prohibits making a campaign contribution in someone else's name. According to the final counts of the indictment, Ms. Pugh allegedly filed false income tax returns for the years 2015 and 2016, in which she underreported her income. For example, the indictment alleges that for tax year 2016, Ms. Pugh claimed her taxable income was a little over $31,000, and the tax due was a little over $4,000. when in fact her taxable income was over $322,000, with an income tax due of approximately over $100,000. In other words, her taxable income was more than 10 times what she reported the IRS for that year, and she owed over 20 times more in taxes than she actually paid for that year. For the crimes alleged in the indictment, Ms. Pugh faces up to 20 years in federal prison for the wire fraud conspiracy and for each of the 7 counts of wire fraud, up to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy to defraud the United States, and up to 5 years in federal prison for each of the 2 counts of tax evasion. Ms. Pugh is scheduled for an initial appearance and an arraignment in U.S. District Court here in Baltimore before Judge Deborah Chazanow. That's scheduled for tomorrow at 1 p.m., and we anticipate that Ms. Pugh will self-surrender to the United States Marshals before then. Also unsealed are the federal indictments and guilty pleas of 2 former Baltimore City employees and associates of Ms. Pugh, Gary Brown Jr. and Rosalind Weddington. Mr. Brown has pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and tax charges relating to the conduct with Ms. Pugh that I have just described. Mr. Brown and Ms. Weddington have also pleaded guilty to tax charges relating to a separate scheme to defraud the United States. Both have admitted that they conspired to avoid tax withholdings from Ms. Weddington's payroll checks, while Ms. Weddington was the executive director of the Maryland Center for Adult Training, and Mr. Brown was the chairman of the board of directors. Specifically, in 2013, Ms. Weddington's salary was garnished due to outstanding student loan debt and medical bills. In order to avoid further garnishments, Ms. Weddington asked Mr. Brown to take her off payroll, which meant that MCAT, or the Maryland Center for Adult Training, would no longer submit her name to the payroll service provider for the purpose of calculating taxes to be withheld from her salary. Mr. Brown agreed to this arrangement. He then wrote checks to Ms. Weddington and gave her cash equal to or greater than her salary. In this manner, no taxes were withheld from the funds that Mr. Brown paid to Ms. Weddington, nor did her salary go through her bank account where it was subject to garnishment. Mr. Brown faces up to 20 years in federal prison for the wire fraud conspiracy, and Ms. Brown and Ms. Weddington each face up to 5 years in federal prison for the count of conspiracy to defraud the United States and 3 years in prison for each count of filing a false tax return. Public office is a rare privilege and opportunity to serve and to get things done for the good of our community. Fraud and corruption of the sort we are addressing today undermine the public's faith in public officials. This is a tragedy and the last thing that our city needs. The community can be sure, however, that the many dedicated investigators and prosecutors that built this prosecution over many months will continue to be on the lookout for evidence of fraud and corruption, and we will follow it wherever the facts may lead.